People often assume that not getting tattoos means hesitation or a lack of personality. But there is another possibility, one that's talked about far less. That you leave no marks, not because you don't know who you are, but because inside, things are already clear. Some people use their bodies to speak, some use their bodies to remain silent, and sometimes that silence isn't emptiness at all, but a space carefully protected. You don't leave marks when the inside is already clear. There is a certain kind of person you've seen many times, yet rarely hear named. They don't have tattoos, and they don't explain why. Not because they hate tattoos, not because they're afraid of pain, and not because they haven't figured out who they are. Simply, they've never felt the need to say something on their body. If you're this kind of person, you may have quietly wondered very quietly whether something is missing. When all around you, everyone seems to carry a marker, a milestone, a story etched into skin, a symbol that can be read at a glance, and you don't. That silence is sometimes misunderstood, mistaken for emptiness, for incompleteness, for being one step short. But pause here. Stand still for a moment, like standing inside a temple. You don't look to the walls, you don't search for inscriptions, you don't look for symbols, you simply stand. And in that space, you don't feel lacking. There is no sense of needing to add, no urge to finish something, no need to justify yourself. There is only a quiet that is unmistakably clear. Not everything unmarked is unfinished. Some surfaces are not left blank because they aren't ready, but because they are already complete. For some people, the body was never a place meant to make statements. And that doesn't mean you lack an identity. It only means your identity doesn't need to be hung up for others to read. There are people who don't feel they owe the world an explanation for their silence, and that, from the very beginning, was never a flaw. In psychology, not everyone needs the same amount of external markers. Some people need to see themselves in order to feel that they exist. Others don't. Not because they are closed off, but because inside them, the signals are already stable. The human mind is always trying to answer an ancient question. Who am I, and will I still be myself in the future? For many people, that answer needs to be anchored through images, through symbols, through visible milestones. But for some, their sense of self is already continuous. They feel like the same person across time, across change, across different chapters of life. And so, they don't need reminders on the surface. Not because they're avoiding anything, but because there is no gap that needs filling. A mind like this doesn't look outward for validation, because inwardly, it may already be stable enough to function without extra signs. Some minds don't look outward for confirmation because inward signals are already stable. This is often misunderstood. Others look at you and assume you're hesitating, or not ready yet, or that you haven't committed. But the truth is far more subtle. You're not postponing the act of marking yourself. You simply don't see the need. Like a temple that stands through many seasons, the light changes, the shadows shift, time moves slowly, but the structure remains. No one thinks that temple needs more inscriptions in order to exist. No one believes the smoothness of its stone palimpsest a flaw. And in the same way, not having tattoos is not a reaction, not a defense, not fear. It is simply the sign of an inner system stable enough to not require additional symbols. This is not avoidance. This is clarity. Standing in the middle of society, you might do nothing at all. And that very stillness is what makes everything feel uneasy. You don't speak much. You don't present yourself. You don't explain through symbols. Your skin tells no story. It simply exists. And in a world accustomed to reading people through visible signs, that silence creates a gap. Not a gap on your body, but a gap inside others. Outside the temple, everything speaks. Symbols, declarations, milestones hung up so they can be understood at a glance. Society is used to people reading one another through easily recognizable signals, each individual placing themselves into a shared language. But when you don't do that, you disrupt that familiar rhythm of reading, not through rebellion, but through absence, and that absence is often misunderstood. When others don't see a message, they begin to search for a reason. They ask themselves, what are you hiding? What aren't you ready for? Or are you refusing to play by the rules? Rarely do they pause to consider another possibility. That maybe, not everyone needs to use their body to make others feel comfortable. In social psychology, people rely on social signals to reduce uncertainty. Those signals help them know who they're facing, how to respond, where to place the other person in their mental map. When the signals disappear, uncertainty appears. And uncertainty almost always creates tension. Not because you're wrong, but because you're not doing the work society has grown used to expecting. You're not helping them read you faster, and that forces them to face something far more difficult, reading themselves. Because when standing before a smooth wall, no words, no images, people can't borrow symbols to locate who they are. Your clarity forces them to confront their own ambiguity, and that is uncomfortable. This is not their fault, and it is not your responsibility. It is simply the natural cost of not broadcasting signals. Your clarity makes others uncomfortable because it leaves them alone with themselves. Imagine the moment again. As you step into the temple, the sounds from outside are still there, but with each step inward, they fade. Not because you shut the door, but because you didn't bring the noise with you. Inside, no one asks you to prove anything. No one needs you to tell your life story on the surface of your body. There is only presence. And that very presence can make those who live by symbols feel disoriented. Not because you stand above them, but because you stand within a different frame of experience. You didn't choose emptiness as a declaration, you simply didn't fill it. And society, so accustomed to every blank space needing an explanation, will name it in many ways. Cold, distant, hard to read, but rarely by its true name. That this is clarity without display. This may be the natural consequence of not sending signals, not being immediately understood, not being quickly read, not offering instant reassurance to others. But in return, you don't have to turn your body into a user manual for the world. And if you ever wonder why your silence seems to unsettle others so deeply, remember this: not every discomfort is yours to resolve. There was a very early time before the body was expected to mean anything. Not an idea, not a philosophy, just a faint, gentle memory. You stood in front of a mirror, not to check anything, not to evaluate, just to look. Your skin, then, was not a surface that required decisions, not a place for choosing. It was simply where you were. There was no question of who am I, no impulse asking, what should I look like? There was only presence, natural, unforced. Maybe it was an early morning, thin light, a mirror still clouded with steam. You don't remember what you were thinking. Because back then, you didn't need to think, and your body existed without captions. Or maybe it was an afternoon by the sea. Salt water, wet skin, a light wind moving through. Your body, in that moment, carried no story at all. No symbols, no milestones, no message sent outward. Just the feeling of water against skin, sunlight, a hint of chill. You didn't see your body as something that needed to be completed. It wasn't unfinished. It was simply alive. No one asked you why you looked the way you did, and you had no answers prepared. Your body wasn't a statement. It was a place. Some people grow up without ever fully leaving that feeling behind. Not because they're stuck in the past, but because they remember clearly what it felt like to exist without needing to be read. As you grow older, the world begins to ask more questions. Who are you? Where do you belong? What do you represent? And many people answer those questions on the surface, with symbols, with marks. There is nothing wrong with that. But for you, there may be something deeper that never found it necessary. Because you once knew the feeling of a body that didn't need to be defined. A body that wasn't responsible for saying anything to the world. And that memory, though distant, remains, not loudly, not demanding. Like a temple at dawn, empty. No rituals, no prayers, just space, and light moving slowly, across smooth walls. In that moment, emptiness was not a lack. It was the condition that allowed you to be present without being pulled into any story. There was a time your body existed without meaning, and it was enough. Not because meaning hadn't yet been given, but because meaning was never a requirement. When you keep your body uninscribed, unmarked, it may be because some part of you still honors that memory, not as nostalgia, but is a very deep standard. That the body doesn't have to carry extra roles. It doesn't need to explain. It doesn't need to represent. It doesn't need to tell your story for you. It only needs to be kept still. And in that stillness, you are not returning to the past. You are simply protecting a space to remind yourself, there was once a time when you existed without having to prove anything. There is a very common misunderstanding that if you don't say who you are, it means you're not standing firmly yet. That if your body carries no marks, it means you haven't chosen. But there is another way of seeing it quieter and deeper, that not getting tattooed is not delay, it is sovereignty, not the right to rebel, not the right to reject others, but the right to not turn your body into a site of negotiation. In philosophy, a space is called sacred not because it is forbidden to touch, but because it is not used casually. Such a space doesn't need decoration to have value. It doesn't need explanation to deserve respect. It is kept intact because it is already enough. When you see your body this way, many questions simply fall away. You no longer need to ask whether you should add something or whether something is missing, because you don't see your body as a surface that needs completion. You see it as a space that already has structure, like a temple. The smooth stone columns are not smooth because someone forgot to carve them, but because someone understood that carving was unnecessary. No one enters a temple to search for the builder's personal message. They enter to be still, and in that stillness, the value of the space becomes unmistakable. A temple isn't empty because it lacks meaning, it's empty because meaning lives inside. When you keep your body unmarked, you are not saying, I have nothing to say. You are saying quietly, I don't need to use my body to speak for me. This is not superiority, nor is it a moral choice. It is a way of existing, a way in which you do not automatically grant access to the space of your body. Not every question requires an answer. Not every gaze needs to be met. And the body, in this view, is no longer a project. It doesn't need updates. It doesn't need to keep up. It doesn't need to be further completed. It only needs to be held in its proper place. When you stand firmly in this, you don't need to defend yourself. You don't need to explain why you don't do what others do. You don't need to compare your choices to anyone else's. Because true sovereignty doesn't need to be declared. It is felt like the deep silence inside a temple. No echo, no response, no demand for recognition. Only presence that cannot be intruded upon. And if there are moments when you wonder whether this quiet will be misunderstood, sacred spaces rarely exist to be understood by everyone. They exist to not be misused. To keep your body as a temple is not to reject the world. It is simply the way you refuse to trade dignity for easy legibility. Not every journey needs a conclusion. Not every clarity needs to be declared. Some things, once they have been seen, only need to be left alone. You don't need to do anything more after hearing this. No decisions, no choices, no changes. Just stay with the feeling that some parts of you were already okay, like standing in a temple whose doors have closed. No one asks you to believe. No one asks what you think. No one waits for your response. There is only space, and a quiet that does not need to be filled. If you don't have tattoos, and you've never felt the need to explain that, then nothing here asks you to start doing otherwise. You're not missing anything. You're not behind anyone. You're simply moving at a different pace. A pace that doesn't require loud declarations, or visible signs, or leaving a trace. Out there, others may still ask. They may still try to read you. They may still assign meaning to your silence. You don't need to stop that. And you don't need to correct it. Because not every misunderstanding is yours to resolve. Remaining still is not avoidance. Sometimes, it is simply the way you respect a space deep enough not to be touched casually. Like a door that is closed not because you fear someone entering, but because inside no one else is needed. Nothing here needs to be explained. If anything remains after these moments, it may be only a very gentle permission. Permission for your body to not become a message. Permission for quiet to not be mistaken for lack. Permission for yourself to not be read correctly by everyone. The light slowly lowers. The space does not change. The temple remains. Nothing added, nothing taken away. You can leave without carrying anything that needs to be said.